What would you do if you were mocked and disrespected in your own establishment, all because no one recognized who you were? In this compelling story, Snoop Dogg goes undercover at his newly acquired high-end restaurant, only to face blatant discrimination and humiliation from his own staff. When Snoop decides to confront the situation, he doesn't just stand up for himself. He reshapes the culture of the entire restaurant, demanding respect and equality for every customer. Get ready for a powerful narrative that challenges assumptions, holds people accountable, and proves the importance of treating everyone with dignity. This is a story of justice, transformation, and the power of standing up for what's right. Subscribe to Mr. Denzel Stories for more impactful narratives like this. Don't forget to like, comment, and share. Snoop Dogg sat in his studio, the dim glow of recording equipment surrounding him. He leaned back in his chair, rolling a cigar between his fingers. It wasn't often that he had time to relax these days, juggling his music, business ventures, and public appearances. Yet tonight, his mind was elsewhere. For months, an idea had taken root in his mind, a personal project, something far removed from his usual ventures. Snoop wanted to open a restaurant. Not just any restaurant, but one that felt like home for anyone who walked through its doors. A sanctuary offering good food and even better vibes. The idea had come to him during a conversation with a friend who mentioned an upscale eatery that was up for sale. Known for its fine dining and chic ambience, the place had a sterling reputation. Whispers of its changing ownership had started circulating, and it was an opportunity Snoop couldn't ignore. He envisioned a spot where he could unwind after a long day or host intimate gatherings with friends, all while ensuring it upheld his values of respect and inclusivity. Quietly, he moved forward. His business manager and lawyers handled the transaction with discretion. He wanted to keep his name out of the spotlight, at least for now. Even after the deal closed, the restaurant staff had no idea their establishment had a new owner, let alone that it was one of the most iconic figures in entertainment. Snoop celebrated his victory in private, sharing a toast with close friends and family. But even as he enjoyed the moment, he knew the real work was only beginning. Owning a restaurant wasn't about signing papers. It was about making sure the place lived up to its vision. He wanted to see the staff in action and understand how they treated their guests. There was only one way to find out. A week later, Snoop sat parked outside the restaurant in an understated black sedan. Nothing flashy to draw attention. He wore a hoodie, jeans, and a baseball cap, the brim pulled low over his face. Tonight, he wasn't Snoop Dogg, the celebrity. He was just another man looking for a good meal. He stepped out of the car, the crisp evening air brushing against him as he walked toward the warmly lit entrance. The restaurant's ambience matched what he had envisioned. Soft clinking of glasses, quiet conversations, and the aroma of expertly crafted dishes. Everything about the space radiated elegance without being ostentatious, a balance he had always appreciated. As Snoop approached the hostess stand, a young woman glanced up from her clipboard. Her expression was polite but distant as she quickly scanned his casual attire. "Good evening," she said. "Do you have a reservation?" Snoop shook his head. "Nah, just me tonight. Got room for one?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering to the seating chart before returning to him. "Let me check," she said, her tone neutral. Disappearing into the dining area for a moment, she returned with a slight frown. "We have a table near the entrance. Follow me." Snoop nodded, trailing behind her as she led him to a small table close to the door. The placement wasn't subtle. It was far from the prime seating areas in the restaurant. She placed the menu down without another word and walked away. Taking his seat, Snoop flipped through the menu, glancing around the room. He observed the staff and other diners, noting their interactions. Servers bustled between tables, laughing and chatting with patrons, their service warm and engaging. Yet, with him, there was a noticeable coldness. No one approached his table for minutes. He raised an eyebrow but kept his patience, wanting to see how the evening would unfold. Finally, a waitress approached. Her name tag read Jessica, but her demeanor was far from welcoming. "What can I get you?" she asked flatly, her tone clipped as though she were doing him a favor. Snoop offered a polite smile. "I'll take the house special and a glass of water." Jessica scribbled on her notepad, barely glancing at him. "Sure," she muttered before turning on her heel and walking away. As he waited, Snoop continued observing the room. The staff's interactions with other patrons were a stark contrast to how Jessica had treated him. It wasn't outright hostility, but it was clear. He was being dismissed. He could feel it in the subtle glances and the coldness of their service. When Jessica returned with his drink, she placed it on the table with a thud, walking away without a word. Snoop took a sip, his mind racing. This wasn't the experience he'd envisioned for his restaurant, not even close. When the main course finally arrived, the presentation was mediocre at best. The garnish was off-center, and the sauce had smeared along the edge of the plate. It was a far cry from the meticulous presentation files he had reviewed with the head chef. He took a bite, only to find the food bland and lacking the care he expected from an establishment of this caliber. Disappointed, he set his fork down and leaned back in his chair, watching the staff. Jessica returned with the check, dropping it on the table carelessly. "Anything else?" she asked, her tone making it clear she hoped the answer was no. "I'm good," Snoop replied calmly, pulling out cash to cover the bill. Despite the poor service, he left a generous tip, not for her, but for himself. It was his way of saying, "I see you." On his way out, Snoop paused by the door, turning to look back at the dining room. None of the staff noticed his lingering gaze. He stepped outside into the cool air, leaning against his car. Staring at the restaurant's glowing sign, he felt a deep sense of disappointment. This wasn't just about a bad meal or poor service. It was about respect, something he believed in deeply. As he climbed into his car and drove away, an idea began to take shape in his mind. He would return, but not as an ordinary customer. The staff would soon realize who he was, and they would face the consequences. The sun was barely up, but Snoop Dogg's phone buzzed nonstop. Notifications flooded in, likes, comments, reposts, and direct messages. The video he had posted the night before had gone viral overnight. Snoop sat at his kitchen counter, sipping his morning coffee while scrolling through the tidal wave of reactions. He had recorded the video right after leaving the restaurant. Calm but sharp, he had spoken directly to his followers, exposing the disrespect he had faced in his own establishment. "What's up, y'all?" the video began, his voice steady and measured. "I just walked out of a restaurant, my restaurant. Yeah, you heard me right, mine. And let me tell you what happened tonight, wasn't it?" He had turned the camera toward the restaurant's glowing sign, giving his audience a glimpse. "This is what happens when they don't know who you are, when they think you don't belong. Tonight, I saw it all. The cold looks, the rude service, the bad food. And it wasn't just me. You know what that tells me? This ain't the first time they've done this." The video ended with his signature, piercing look into the camera. "Y'all know me. I don't let things like this slide. Stay tuned. This story ain't over." As Snoop scrolled through the comments, the public's response was as intense as he had expected. They disrespected Snoop? Nah, this gotta stop. Imagine how they treat people who don't own the place. Name and shame the whole staff. The hashtags #RespectSnoop and #BoycottTheSpot were trending, and even fellow artists like Kendrick Lamar and Ice Cube had shared the video, adding captions like "unacceptable" and "this has to change." The media quickly picked up the story. Headlines splashed across news sites. Snoop Dogg exposes restaurant staff for disrespect and racism. Snoop Dogg's undercover visit sparks outrage. The icon strikes back. Restaurant faces backlash. As reporters speculated about his next move, Snoop leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow exhale. The plan was working. The world was watching now, and the restaurant staff had no idea what was coming. Jessica, the waitress from the night before, stood at the server station, her phone glued to her hand. Her face was pale as she scrolled through social media. Her name was trending, tagged in hundreds of posts. "Apologize to Snoop." "Shame on you, Jessica. I hope you like unemployment." Her hands shook as she tapped through the messages, some critical, others outright threatening. The internet had found her, and it wasn't letting up. She turned to Carlos, one of her co-workers, who was wiping down a table nearby. "This is insane," she muttered. "They're acting like I did something awful. It wasn't that bad." Carlos glanced at her, frowning. "Not that bad? You saw what he posted. You think the world's just gonna let it slide?" He motioned toward the front window, where reporters were gathering with cameras and microphones. Jessica's stomach twisted as she peered outside. News vans lined the curb, and onlookers stood nearby, filming on their phones. The once bustling restaurant was now the center of a public spectacle. Tyler, one of the cooks, leaned against the kitchen doorway, his arms crossed. "Y'all better get ready," he said, his voice low. "If he shows up, it's game over. Ain't no hiding from this." Victor, the restaurant manager, walked in at that moment, his tie already loosened and his face flushed with stress. "Listen up," he barked, clapping his hands to get their attention. "Nobody talks to the press. If they ask you anything, you say, 'No comment.' Got it?" The staff nodded, but the tension was palpable. Victor's eyes darted around the room, landing on Jessica. "And you," he said, pointing a finger. "If Snoop Dogg walks through that door, you smile, apologize, and keep your mouth shut. Do not make this worse." Jessica swallowed hard, her heart pounding. "He's not really coming, is he?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Celebrities always say they're gonna show up, but they don't." Tyler snorted. "You think Snoop's bluffing? He ain't the type." Before Jessica could respond, the door chime rang. Every head turned in unison. Relief swept over the room when it turned out to be an elderly couple walking in, chatting cheerfully. But the reprieve was short-lived. Minutes later, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. The engine cut off, and for a moment, everything stood still. Carlos, watching from the window, cursed under his breath. "Oh, he's here." Jessica's heart dropped as she saw the driver's side door open. There he was, Snoop Dogg, stepping out in a black designer suit, his gold chain gleaming in the sunlight. This wasn't the low-key man in a hoodie from the other night. This was the icon, the mogul, the man who had built an empire. And now, he was walking straight toward the restaurant. Reporters swarmed, shouting questions and snapping photos. "Snoop, are you shutting down the restaurant? Are you firing the staff? What's your next move?" He didn't acknowledge any of them. His stride was slow, deliberate, and commanding. Inside, Victor's face turned ashen. "All right, everybody," he said, his voice cracking. "Stay cool. Stay professional." The front door swung open, and the restaurant fell silent. Forks hovered over plates, conversations stopped mid-sentence, and all eyes turned to Snoop Dogg as he stepped inside. His gaze swept the room, sharp and unyielding. He didn't speak at first, letting the weight of his presence settle over everyone. Jessica's breath hitched as his eyes landed on her. She felt as though the ground beneath her feet had disappeared. This was it. There was no escaping the moment. Snoop took a slow step forward, his voice breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. "I'm sure y'all know who I am by now," he said, his tone smooth but cutting. "And I'm sure y'all know why I'm here." Snoop's words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. The room stayed silent as his gaze swept across the staff, lingering on Jessica just long enough to make her shift uncomfortably. "The other night," he began, his voice calm but sharp, "I walked into this place. No entourage, no cameras, just me." He paused, letting the words settle. "I watched. I listened. And what I saw," he tilted his head slightly, his gaze slicing through the tension, "was straight-up disrespect." Jessica flinched, her knees threatening to buckle. The weight of his words bore down on her, but she couldn't look away. Her breath quickened, and her heart pounded in her chest. Snoop pointed directly at her, his movements deliberate and measured. "You. Step forward." Jessica's eyes darted toward Victor, silently begging for guidance, but he didn't move. Nobody did. With her heart in her throat, she stepped forward stiffly, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Look at me," Snoop commanded, his voice low but firm. She hesitated for a moment before raising her eyes to meet his. The intensity in his stare made her stomach churn. "You know what you did," he said, each word landing like a hammer. "You know how you made me feel. But this ain't just about me." He gestured to the room around him. "You disrespected everybody who walks through those doors." Jessica's breath came in shallow bursts, tears welling in her eyes. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. "Tell me," Snoop continued, his voice quiet but piercing, Why should I let you stay? Her lips trembled as she opened her mouth to respond, but all she could manage was a weak shake of her head. That's what I thought, Snoop said coldly. He turned to Victor, his expression unyielding. She's done. Pack her up. Victor nodded quickly, his voice cracking. Yes, sir. Jessica covered her face with her hands as tears spilled over. She turned and walked toward the back, her movements mechanical, her sobs muffled as she disappeared from view. Snoop turned back to the rest of the staff, his gaze sweeping across them like a spotlight. Everybody else, he said, his voice steady but charged with authority. Take notes? This ain't just about me. It's about every customer who walks through these doors. I built this place to be a spot for everybody. And if you're not about that, then you can walk too. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one dared to speak or even breathe too loudly. Cameras flashed outside, and reporters murmured, their voices muffled by the thick glass. The world was watching. Snoop let the weight of his words linger before nodding once. Y'all know what it is, he said, his voice firm but calm. Fix it. With that, he turned and walked toward the door. The moment it swung shut behind him, the room seemed to deflate. The air was thick with unease, every staff member acutely aware of the gravity of what had just happened. Victor ran a hand over his face, muttering under his breath, This is bad. This is really bad. Carlos leaned against a nearby table, rubbing his hands together nervously. Man, he wasn't playing, he said, his voice low. He meant every word. Tyler folded his arms, shaking his head. I told y'all. You wanted to play games, and now look. Ain't nobody laughing now. Jessica's absence was a stark reminder of how quickly things had changed. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, each of them silently wondering who might be next. Minutes later, the front door swung open again, this time with sharp precision. 3 men in black suits entered, their presence commanding. Behind them was a man in a tailored gray suit, his expression cold and unreadable. He didn't need to announce himself. The weight of his authority was evident in every step. The man, Daniel Cross, stopped in the center of the room, his eyes scanning the staff like a hawk assessing its prey. I'm Daniel Cross, he said, his voice smooth but razor-sharp. Regional Director. And I think you all know why I'm here. Victor stepped forward hesitantly, his hands wringing nervously. Sir, I've been managing the situation, he stammered. Keeping everything under control. Stop, Daniel said, holding up a hand. His tone was cutting, leaving no room for argument. If you were managing the situation, we wouldn't be here. One of the suited men stepped forward, holding a sleek black tablet. Daniel tapped on the screen, his expression hardening. This is footage from your restaurant, he said, his gaze fixed on Victor. Last night, this morning, you want to see yourself in it? Victor's face turned pale. No, sir. Daniel didn't wait for a response. He held the tablet up, playing a clip. There it was, Victor standing at the server station, laughing with Jessica as Snoop sat unattended. The evidence was irrefutable. You see, Daniel said, his voice ice-cold, this isn't just about the staff. It's about leadership. And when leadership is rotten, everything beneath it rots too. Victor opened his mouth to speak, but Daniel cut him off. You're done, he said. Turn in your keys and leave. Now. Victor's shoulders sagged as he fumbled to unhook his keychain, his hands shaking. He handed it to a security guard before shuffling toward the door. No one spoke. No one stopped him. When the door closed behind him, Daniel turned back to the staff. Here's how this is going to go, he said, his tone firm and unyielding. If you were laughing, you're out. If you were standing by and saying nothing, you're out. If you think Snoop Dogg's name means less than any other customer who walks through that door, you're out. Daniel Cross stood tall in the center of the restaurant, his commanding presence silencing the room. His gaze locked on Victor, the now disgraced manager. The tension in the air was palpable as Daniel spoke, his tone sharp and unwavering. Victor, he began, you had one job, to lead this team with integrity and professionalism. Instead, you became part of the problem. Victor shifted uncomfortably, the sweat on his forehead glistening under the restaurant's soft lighting. Sir, he began, but Daniel cut him off with a raised hand. Stop, Daniel said firmly. We've reviewed security footage. We've seen the interactions. You didn't just ignore what was happening. You participated in it. And for that, your time here is over. Victor's face went pale as Daniel pointed to the door. Hand in your keys and leave. The room was silent as Victor fumbled to remove his keyring. He handed it to one of the security guards and, without another word, turned to leave. His footsteps echoed as he walked out, the weight of his dismissal heavy on everyone watching. Daniel turned back to the remaining staff, his eyes scanning the room. Now, let me make this clear. This isn't just about firing one or two people. This is about rebuilding trust and respect, starting today. He paused, letting his words sink in. For those of you who laughed, who stood by and said nothing, or who treated customers like they didn't belong, you have a choice. You can walk out right now, or you can stay and commit to the new standards we're implementing. For a moment, no one moved. Then, one by one, a few staff members removed their aprons, setting them down on tables as they quietly exited the restaurant. By the time the door closed behind the last of them, only the most determined employees remained. Daniel nodded approvingly. Good. Now, for those of you who stayed, training starts immediately. Respect, professionalism, and service excellence. Those are your new priorities. There will be no warnings, no second chances. Get it wrong, and you're gone. The sun hung high in the sky as a sleek black SUV pulled up outside the restaurant. The staff inside moved with quiet precision, but the tension was palpable. Carlos wiped down a table that was already spotless, his hands trembling slightly. Emily folded napkins at the front counter, her fingers working with mechanical precision, while Tyler leaned against the kitchen counter, his normally cocky demeanor replaced by a focused seriousness. When the SUV door opened, Snoop Dogg stepped out, his sharp black suit and gold chain catching the sunlight. There were no hoodies, no disguises, just Snoop, in full power mode, walking with a deliberate, confident stride. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing and microphones raised, but he ignored them. His focus was on the restaurant. Inside, heads turned as the door swung open. Snoop stepped in, his gaze sweeping the room. His presence felt heavy, commanding attention without a single word. The staff straightened, their movements halting as they watched him make his way to the center of the dining room. Good morning, Snoop said, his voice calm but cutting through the air like a blade. Good morning, sir, the staff replied in unison, their voices shaky but loud enough to be heard. Snoop nodded, his eyes narrowing as he scanned their faces. Better, he said, his tone measured. But better isn't good enough. Not yet. Daniel Cross entered behind him, his gray suit crisp and his expression unreadable. He carried a stack of papers, a clipboard, and a firm air of authority as he stood by Snoop's side. Snoop walked up to Emily first. She stiffened, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. What's your name? He asked, tilting his head slightly. Emily, sir, she said, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. Snoop nodded. You do good work, Emily? Yes, sir. I do, she replied, her tone confident. He studied her for a moment before nodding slowly. I believe you, he said. Keep it up. Thank you, sir, she said, her chest swelling with pride. He moved to Carlos next, who stood frozen in place. You focused, Carlos? Snoop asked, his gaze piercing. Yes, sir. Always, Carlos replied quickly, nodding. Snoop leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Good. Keep it that way. No slippin'. You hear me? Yes, sir, Carlos said, his voice strong despite his nerves. When Snoop turned to Tyler, the cook was ready. I'm ready, boss, Tyler said, his voice clear and confident. Been ready. For the first time, Snoop smirked, a small, knowing grin. That's what I like to hear, he said, tapping the counter twice with his knuckles. Keep that same energy, Tyler. I see you. Snoop turned to face the entire staff, his gaze moving deliberately from one employee to the next. Each look felt like a spotlight, forcing them to stand straighter, sharper, and more attentive. Y'all know why I'm here, he began, his voice calm yet carrying the weight of thunder. You know what I'm about, respect. Every customer that walks through this door gets the same energy y'all give me. No matter who they are, no matter what they look like. He glanced toward Emily, whose posture remained upright, her chin slightly raised. That sound good to you, Emily? Yes, sir, she responded firmly. Good, Snoop said, nodding. Then prove it. He gestured toward Daniel, who stepped forward, clipboard in hand. Daniel's voice was sharp and commanding as he laid out the new rules. Starting today, every employee will undergo mandatory training in respect, conflict de-escalation, and customer service. This training is not optional. You complete it, you stay. You miss one session, you're gone. Daniel's eyes swept the room, daring anyone to protest. No warnings, no second chances. The staff nodded, the seriousness of the moment settling into their expressions. Snoop stepped forward again, his hands in his pockets, his voice softer now, but no less impactful. You give respect, you get it back, he said, his words measured and deliberate. This ain't just a job. This is Snoop Dogg's house, and I expect every shift, every table, every customer to reflect that. No more bad days. No more slip-ups. He paused, letting the silence amplify the weight of his words. Next time I walk in here, I better see smiles, not excuses. You feel me? Yes, sir, the staff responded in unison, their voices stronger this time. Snoop gave a satisfied nod, his gaze lingering on each employee for a moment longer. Then, without another word, he turned toward the door, his stride smooth and deliberate. Reporters outside scrambled to capture his exit, cameras flashing wildly as he stepped into the spotlight. Before he crossed the threshold, he glanced back briefly. Y'all tell them Snoop sent you, he said with a small grin before disappearing into the sunlight. Inside the restaurant, the air remained heavy, but it wasn't the same tense silence as before. It was the stillness of a place recalibrating, adjusting to a new standard. Tyler exhaled, wiping his hands on his apron. Well, he muttered, shaking his head, this ain't never gonna be the same. Carlos leaned against a counter, rubbing his temples. Yeah, he said quietly, his eyes on the door. I feel that. Emily smiled faintly, her hands relaxing at last as she looked toward the kitchen. Good, she said softly. It's about time. The restaurant had turned a corner. It was no longer just a business. It was a symbol of respect, equality, and change. For the staff who remained, it was a second chance to do things the right way. For Snoop, it was a victory for his vision. The story concludes with a message to the audience. Respect is earned through actions, not words. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more inspiring stories of justice, change, and redemption.